Hi there, welcome to A Little Wayward podcast coming out of St. Therese Institute of Faith and Mission. Today we're gathering in the new year of 2021, Jim and myself, just to discuss this new document that came out recently. I forget exactly how recently it was, and it's called Patris Corde. Corde, I think. My Latin's really rusty.
And that's how I'm pronouncing it, Patris Corde.
Yeah, that's how I'm pronouncing it too.
It was published on the feast of the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception.
That's
December the 8th, which was actually inaugurating another new year from December the 8th, 2020 to December the 8th, 2021, which is a year dedicated to
St. Joseph.
St. Joseph.
Yeah, so this apostolic letter of Pope Francis is actually on the 150th anniversary of the proclamation of St. Joseph as the patron of the universal church, which is also really, really interesting. And so he's made the year of St. Joseph just for us to kind of reflect on St. Joseph as a man and as the foster father of Jesus. And with it was this apostolic letter, sort of just stepping into a little closer, examining the heart of Saint Joseph.
Before you do that, though, Nick, if I may, this was the 150th anniversary of the naming of Joseph as patron of the Universal Church. What's understood as the Universal Church? What's the significance of that, and the significance of this document in your mind at this time in church history, 150 years later?
So when I think the universal church, I'm thinking the church in all of her aspects, not connected to one particular culture, but spanning across cultures. Really reflecting on it as the mystical body of Christ, as the spiritual entity that has stretched across all ages and all time. But particularly, I think there's a fittingness in reflecting upon it as the mystical body of Christ, and also, frankly, as the bride for the bridegroom in some ways. The father of the bride.
Father of the bride, interesting notion.
Yeah, and also even as Christ's body, well, who cared for Christ's body? But not just his body, his person, but St. Joseph. So I think 150 years ago, this was in a time of great social change in the church. There was the seizure of the papal states, a new understanding of the church's relationship to society. There was also many revolutions happening in society, lots of turbulence, mirroring in many ways, frankly, the turbulence that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus underwent in the early days of Jesus' conception and birth. You know, the whole nativity story is one filled with this question of shifting politics and ideals and questions of messianic expectation. So the church really dedicated St. Joseph as the patron or the protector of the church in many ways, just to realize that he was the first protector of Christ and of the Holy Family. And so fast forward to our times now, 150 years later, where we seem to be experiencing similar kind of travails and groanings in our time, you know, with the pandemic that hit us last year, 2020, but also we're in a peculiar state of ecclesial, civil, and interpersonal turmoil. Like, I don't think there's anyone in our times who has not felt this destabilization in the last few years, but even the last year in particular. And so I think that Pope Francis, in inaugurating a year of St. Joseph, is asking us to reflect on this protector figure, St. Joseph, and accept him into our lives a little more, so as to not just place ourselves under his protection, but also under the protection of Christ and becoming brothers with Christ once again. So I mean, that's those are the themes that are immediately appearing to me. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's beautiful. I think we can tend to overlook the notion universal church. I like the way that you described that. We're speaking of the mystical body of Christ. Of course, the word Catholic meaning universal, but we're not speaking about Joseph as the patron of the Roman Catholic Church. We're not speaking about a denomination. We're speaking about the church instituted by Christ in its fullest sense, and even in this time of fracture and fissure in all of the denominations. This is Saint Joseph as patron of, one might say, of all Christians. the mystical body of Christ and of its mission to reach out to all hearts, all persons, and extending as the Church's communion and mission. Both are essential. If we stretch back the mind to 150 years, that would have put us into a time of a lot of revolution, a lot of political upheaval, in the modern age, the kind of exaltation of human endeavor. Unfortunately, to the denigration of human dignity, it would seem. That would, because it would have put us squarely into the Industrial Revolution, a significant revolution. So it's little wonder then that we are proposed the example of Saint Joseph as a worker. And of course, we have the two great feasts of Saint Joseph, the spouse of Mary, and the solemnity of Joseph. That's on March the 19th. And then May the 1st, St. Joseph the Worker. In a sense, who Joseph is and then what Joseph does. And I think we are very much, as you say, in this time now of a need for a reaffirmation of the fundamental dignity of the human person and striving for that. And so much upheaval that we're feeling in the Church and in society, I believe is rooted in a lack of respect and reverence for the fundamental dignity of the human person. Saint Joseph as the provider, protector, as the father of Jesus. And indeed, that's how Pope Francis begins this document. With a father's heart is how Joseph loved Jesus, whom all four of the Gospels refer to as the son of Joseph. So, with our devotions to Jesus, when we hear him say, "Come to me and learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart," well, where did Christ learn that? Yes, Christ is divine, but we also recognize that the one virtue that Jesus needed to learn was obedience. Who did he learn that from?
I'd venture to say Joseph.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of in the backdrop of your point there is even John Paul II's assertion in his document, Guardian of the Redeemer, that just because Joseph was a foster father did not mean he did not exercise true fatherhood of Jesus. And so I think we can even see like this tension between, but really this beautiful complementarity, if you actually look at it closer, between Jesus's father in heaven and then also Joseph's fatherhood in the finding of the temple, of course. Did you not know I would be in my father's house? But then he returned home and was obedient to them until the time of his ministry, And so, rather than a snub against Mary and Joseph, it's actually quite a testament. So I think, yes, he did learn obedience through there.
And that notion of a father is so much, it's the disposition of the heart. And I think that's what Francis is calling us all to in this document. It calls to mind this sentence that Pope Francis has later in the document. It says, "Fathers are not born, but made." I wonder if there might be a little nuance on that too. A father is not a father simply because of the birth of a child. A man does not become a father simply by bringing a child into the world, but by taking up the responsibility to care for that child. It's about the responsibility. So fathers are not born, fathers are not made because of the birth of a child. They're made. They're made by the disposition of heart, and I think that's what St. Joseph really shows us.
And the taking up that responsibility and that charity, fatherhood is not a physical happenstance primarily, although biological fatherhood is kind of what we're talking about here, I suppose.
That's the beginning of the story, perhaps, but at the essence of the heart of the Father is the disposition of the heart. Certainly what Pope Francis speaks of. What were some of the key points that really struck you as you're reading this document, which is, I might say strangely for Pope Francis, quite brief?
Yeah, he's known for going off on multiple pages, sometimes up to 250.
Well, for comparison's purposes, the Christus Vivit, Fratelli Tutti, and Patris Corde.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I guess it's the difference between an apostolic letter and an encyclical and all the rest.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that that's because he doesn't have much to say. I think that in this document he actually just gets to the point very quickly, very pointedly, and very beautifully.
Yeah, I will start off by saying that I really enjoyed reading it. And it's interesting because when you and I were discussing this before coming into the podcast, there were certain points that struck you more intensely than it struck me, but there was a general agreement in the principles. And so I think that, me as a young father, I was kind of drawing certain things from it, and you as someone who your children have led. I'm not going to say old father.
Old father. A father of older children.
A father of children who have,
I know what you mean.
Who have
I get it.
moved out of the home. Let's be as wordy as we can, shall we? It's interesting, but so there are a few salient points I think that do come out of the document. As you say, he's very succinct in this one. So, I dare venture to say that if you're wanting to really know maybe a deeper insight into his papacy, reading this document might be actually a really good place to start. And you were sort of saying that in our reflections before coming to it. But some things that really struck out to me, and we'll talk about some of these in more depth later on. He talks about how Joseph was an example of power and weakness. He talked about the economy of salvation, or the movements of God towards securing salvation for his people, and the dynamic with human weakness. That was a really interesting little snippet, section, and it relates a lot to Saint Therese's little way of weakness, of recognizing one's powerlessness and inviting God in. And Pope Francis even makes the point that it's through human weakness that actually God is able to work his strength. And one can have deeper reflections on that. He also, there was also a fascinating point where it shows that we hear about Mary's fiat, or her assent of faith towards accepting Jesus into her life in the vision of the angel. But Joseph himself had his own form of the fiat in his response to the angel's vision, and also the circumstances of life. There were 4 dreams that he had, and each one there was a yes, and with seemingly little hesitation. The gospel records none, and we're told he's a just man and all the rest. And so there's this fiat in the yes to the circumstances, no matter how many uncertainties are there. And personally, I found that very relevant, because these are uncertain times. And the question of saying yes to Caesar, but also trying to protect one's family is very on level here. There was an interesting commentary on Jesus being formed not only by God but by Joseph himself in a real fatherhood, which was fascinating. There was a very interesting dynamic between Joseph not so much being not being a symbol necessarily of explanation for why God, say, permits evil in the world, or uncertainty, or bad things happening to good people, but as a symbol of trust and acceptance in the face of these things, which I thought was really interesting. A living out of the principle that God turns all things to the good, including evil things, says St. Augustine. There was a section on creative courage, which I thought was quite enheartening. Of course, there's mention of Joseph the worker, and Joseph as protector, but then a very interesting section on Joseph the chaste spouse, and Joseph as protector but not possessor of Christ, and Mary. And so Pope Francis kind of steps into a reflection on that true love is not possessive. It seeks to give. It doesn't, and it seeks to protect, of course, and judge in due time when, for example, in the raising of children, it's time to expose them to a challenge or not. But it's never a matter of holding on to them. And so that was one thing I took for myself. And then there was actually a very fascinating discussion of how that connects to chastity. And a particular line that you found very striking near the end of the document, which I think might form a bit of the conversation that we have forward. What was that line, Jim, that really hit you?
It was the increasing sense of uselessness, and maybe that is simply because of the place I am in my natural fatherhood, with my own children who are young men making their way in the world, and I'm very proud of them. But I find increasingly there's not much I can offer other than my availability, my prayer, my words of encouragement, which I do increasingly from the peripheries of their life, from the margins of their life. And it's interesting that this whole section is in the seventh reflection on St. Joseph that Pope Francis offers, a father in the shadows, that notion of being in the shadows, which has kind of a double meaning, I find, as I read it. On one hand, and Pope Francis speaks of this too, alludes to it at least. On one hand, there's being in the shadow of the Father. So Joseph's fatherhood is a reflection, or is overcast by the fatherhood of God. And you can see this obviously in the life of Jesus, that Joseph's fatherhood was the image of the fatherhood of God the Father to God the Son, to Jesus in his humanity. But there's also the father in the shadows, that sense of hiddenness and silence, marginalization, which Pope Francis is so wont to express all of the time about going to the peripheries, being in the margins. And certainly this is what fatherhood is called to. So it was this line that spoke to my heart and probably caught my attention mostly because of my own experience, and not only with my own children, but with the students whom I work with as well. With whom I work, and the importance of, in a sense, being a launch pad, investing heavily, and then allowing it go. I often joke about trying to work myself out of a job, and I think that's what Pope Francis is saying a father is one who works himself out of a job. He says this: when fathers refuse to live the lives of their children for them, new and unexpected vistas open up. Every child is the bearer of a unique mystery that can only be brought to light with the help of a father who respects that child's freedom. And this constant reference to freedom is key. And I think that's a key interpretive point for the entire document, and in fact, possibly for the entire pontificate of Pope Francis, his whole sense of freedom. This was the line. A father realizes that he is most a father and educator at the point when he becomes useless, when he sees that his child has become independent and can walk the paths of life unaccompanied, when he becomes like Joseph, who always knew that his child was not his own, but had merely been entrusted to his care. In the end, this is what Jesus would have us understand when he says, "Call no man your father on earth, for you have only one Father, who is in heaven." So that deep sense of falling to the wayside. I've invested, I've done what I can, but must not cling. So I think that caught my attention, Nick, because of my own circumstances, personally, professionally, and my reflections on that. I have a great and growing devotion to Joseph. So he was leading me there, but I think it was that personal catching that led to a deeper reflection that kind of brought a light to the entire document. And I think it's interesting, you mentioned chastity. And certainly if we think of Joseph, it's often Joseph, the most chaste spouse of Mary, is one of those titles that most immediately pops to mind. And yet, for some reason, Pope Francis chose not to speak of Joseph with that title. The 7 things that he mentions St. Joseph, there's 7 articles: a beloved father, a tender and loving father, an obedient father, an accepting father, a creatively courageous father, a working father, and then a father in the shadows. And it's in the context of a father in the shadows that he mentions chastity, but he gives a beautiful understanding of what chastity is, and it really is about that freedom. I don't know about you, but so often my own mind and my own experience, we tend to think of chastity as not having sex, or
that's just continence.
Physical purity, mental purity. But Pope Francis leads us into a much, much deeper understanding that chastity is freedom from possessiveness, as he says, in every sphere of one's life. Only when love is chaste is it truly love. A possessive love ultimately becomes dangerous. It imprisons, constricts, and makes for misery. The logic of love is always the logic of freedom. What a beautiful notion.
Yeah, and you know what? I think that this is a bit of a recovery in some ways. It really is, I think, developing what John Paul II was talking about with, we're going to talk about this more, the law of the gift. Man only finds himself in a sincere, disinterested gift of self. But it's interesting because I was just recently teaching the students the section of the Catechism on the what was it, the 6th or 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And there was that section on chastity, and I went into it and I've read that section quite a few times before, but the way it describes chastity is it's not so much about preserving purity of heart, emotional purity, physical purity, all that kind of stuff, although that's certainly part of its question and concern. It's actually, the Catechism describes it as an apprenticeship in self-mastery. And that self-mastery is always oriented towards integrity of self so as to give oneself. And that connects to what John Paul II says as self-possession and self-governance so as to give of self. We can't give if we are not in full possession of ourselves. If we are out of control, then it's an unreliable self-gift, you know. And so I thought it was very interesting, actually. I didn't really notice, actually, until you said, A Father in the Shadows is the overall title for this section. And I think that's really highlighting the nature of chastity as oriented towards that self-forgetfulness.
And oriented towards fatherhood.
Yes.
This is the key. And this is not just fatherhood for those who are fathers naturally, biologically. This is a fatherhood that is part of what we might describe as the masculine genius, which is not exclusive to half of the human family. There's actually, that's a whole other discussion, but it's any time that we are all entrusted with this creative genius. St. Joseph is actually a model for all, not just a model for men. He's a model for all. And there's the nurturing and tender side, which all of us have, including men should have a nurturing and tender side, what might be described as the maternal. So too, there needs to be this deep understanding. It's important for us to understand ourselves as human beings, to recognize this disinterested gift of self, this law of the gift, and the way that. And I think St. Joseph teaches us that. And I think this is where Pope Francis is going much deeper in this. I was struck, Nick, as I was reflecting on this. You know, I've had a chance to read it a couple of times and ponder it. And my reflections keep leading me back to that notion of the law of the gift. The gift of self, Pope Francis mentions it very clearly in this section. It's almost in this very brief document, that principle of begin with the ending in mind, or the Hebrew notion that which is mentioned last was intended first. And the whole thing leads us to a Father in the shadows. And the Father in the shadows is the one who offers the image of the love that God the Father has for all of creation by making this disinterested gift of self. Pope Francis is very blunt. He says, our gift of self will not come to fulfillment if it stops at sacrifice. Were that the case, instead of becoming a sign of the beauty and joy of love, the gift of self would risk becoming an expression of unhappiness, sadness, and frustration. What you essentially end up with is, without the gift of self being beyond self-sacrifice, to being an authentic self-donation, this gift, it ends up being a love that is lifeless. Yeah, I know. And there's a real danger in that.
Well, and to tell you the truth, it's funny because I think we can all sort of see some real-world analogies in this. We all have met, I think, families whose fathers will actually self-sacrifice to the point of, oh, I've got to work harder so that my kids have this and this opportunity to go to that school, etc. But in the end, what the kids want often is that self-donation, that presence of the father. And it's not just about the father spending himself so as to accumulate all these goods, but there's actually something that the father is that only he can give. And this, I think, is that act of self-donation. I think self-donation is the key. With self-sacrifice being a means in many ways. We can sometimes forget that the main purpose of life is not the cross, but what comes after. The cross is the path. And so we can never, there's no side of reality that's not touched by the cross in some way. But it was at the heart of the cross was the incarnation, which is all about this, this affirmation of presence.
Something we were speaking of a while back.
Yes, and that podcast on
I feel I should clarify, lest I be misunderstood. So many of these ideas are still half-baked and just kind of gestating. I'm finding that. But in light of what I was saying before, I don't want to be misunderstood as doing away with in any way doing away with the gender distinction or the importance of that,
Yep.
or saying that we're all fathers, we're all mothers. Not at all. We're all human beings, and we
Yes.
express that in maleness and femaleness. So I recognize that. I think what Pope Francis is doing here is just leading us into a much, much deeper reflection on theology of the body. So lest somebody be concerned that I be...
Oh, we can do a podcast to
but that's a
clarify
whole
that one.
other conversation. Yeah, that's a long and extended footnote, and then another, which leads to another discussion. Point being, I just wanted to emphasize that this document is not geared specifically or primarily to
men or to
men
specifically
or
biological
to biological fathers.
Yeah.
It's speaking a fundamentally human message. As I reflect on this, I'm conscious of other places that Pope Francis has spoken about fatherhood. And I think this is interesting. So if I could just kind of go down this little rabbit trail for a moment. As I was reading this, you see Pope Francis saying, in every exercise of our fatherhood, we should always keep in mind that it has nothing to do with possession, but is rather a sign pointing to a greater fatherhood. It's always pointing to God. There's a sacramentality to the whole thing that is profound. As I was reading this, it brought to mind something that Pope Francis wrote in another recent document, Fratelli Tutti, in Article 4, when he is reflecting on Saint Francis, his namesake. And he's quoting a Franciscan priest, and he mentions, indeed, only the man who approaches others not to draw them into his own life, but to help them become ever more fully themselves, can truly be called a father. That line stuck out in my mind powerfully as well. Again, what we're speaking about here is that gift of self, that disinterested gift of self, that love which is not self-referential, but is sacrificial, and not merely self-sacrificial, but is gift of self, a joyful, wholehearted, loving, and decentering. It moves one out of the center, making a space for the other. As I was reflecting on that, it brought to mind something from Christus Vivit in the light of this. It's just beautiful. I see this trickle down, and what I'm seeing increasingly are these threads, these themes. And one of the big themes is this practical living out of the law of the gift that John Paul II spent so much time articulating, starting with his work in Gaudium et Spes in the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes 22 and 24, the encounter with Christ that reveals, that starts to reveal the mystery of man, but then the gift, where we truly come to understand ourselves. I can't understand myself except in the gift. And in Christus Vivit, Pope Francis mentions this too, in Article 285 and 286. He speaks about all of these questions that we ask ourselves when we're seeking to discern our vocation. Asking, do I know myself? What are my weaknesses? What are my strengths? What do I love? What do I not love? What abilities do I have to offer the church? And he says all of these questions, 286, these questions should be centered less on ourselves and our own inclinations than on others, so that our discernment leads us to see our life in relation to their lives. And this is kind of a little bit of a punch to the gut that he delivers here, I find. I would remind you of the most important question of all. So often in life, he says, we waste time asking ourselves, who am I? You can keep asking, who am I for the rest of your lives? But the real question is, for whom am I? Of course, you are for God. But he has decided that you should be for others. And he has given you many qualities, inclinations, gifts, and charisms that are not for you, but to share with those around you. So this notion of being for another is the gift of self. So it's beautiful, the connection between this notion of young people and discernment and vocation and the example that is given us in St. Joseph and this thread that is running through all of Pope Francis's documents. It's like John Paul II, as a philosopher, theologian, articulating clearly these principles, theology of the body, and Pope Francis saying, and this is how we walk it out, this is how we walk it out, this is how we walk it out, this constant call to a gift of self. I see, Nick, sorry, I'm kind of going on for a bit, but the last thought I just have is kind of even in the structure of the entire document, I'm looking forward to actually rereading this document through the very clear lens of the law of the gift, the gift of self. But even the structure of the document, I was struck by this. It's like the first thing that is mentioned is a beloved father. And then Pope Francis, a tender and loving father, an obedient father. But the first one sticks out. It's a beloved father. That's not speaking about the disposition of Joseph's heart. It's actually speaking about the relationship of other people with Joseph. That Joseph is first and foremost a beloved father, which actually brings the whole discussion of Joseph into the context of his relationship with others, which is the whole point of what Pope Francis is saying a father is. A father is not about who is Joseph, but it's almost as if, who is Joseph for? For whom am I? And Joseph's the whole discussion. So he's beloved father, and every father is a beloved father if they've lived this law of the gift. And then the disposition of heart, we have section 2, tender and loving, obedient, accepting of circumstances, of weakness, of everything. And I love this little notion in here too that, so often we are wrestling with, why doesn't God send an answer to the problems? Well, Joseph was the answer to that difficulty, and sometimes we are the answer to the difficulties that we find. We are God's creative word. His creativity and his courage, his work. But then number 7, again, is a bit of an anomaly. We have these 5 dispositions of heart, and then where is he? So where is he in relationship to others? He's beloved. And where is he as he exercises these dispositions of heart, these gifts? He's in the shadows. In the shadow of the Father as a sacrament, but also in the margins, not at the center. Drawing people into his life, not for his sake, but for theirs. I'm really blown away by this. The logic of love is the logic of freedom. A freedom which is beyond self-sacrifice, though involves self-sacrifice, which is about just being gift.
Well, thank you for tuning in.
So you can see it's went on a. But these are the thoughts that have been really in my mind this last week as I've been chewing on this document more. And still, as I said, half baked. I'm needing to go. There's so much there. But I'm excited by this, Nick.
Yes, I can tell.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a couple things to say. Number one, it's interesting.
I'm not sure if we have time.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jim. It's been a great time talking. See you next week.
No.
Yeah,
I'm interested. Go
it's all
for
good.
it. Yeah.
Number one, I think just sort of listening to you speak, there's something to be said about the intentionality that even goes into small documents like this. I think that there's something there in the structure that you mentioned, along with the themes that you're seeing. But I think that's why it's one of the cool things I think about reading documents coming out from our Holy Father, Benedict John Paul II, and Francis is, what was his name? Marshall McLuhan one time said, the medium is the message. And so often it's not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it and the structure of what they're saying it. That I think that there's just a lot of depth that we sometimes don't see or are not patient enough to see. We don't take our time with these things. So you doing this level of deep reading, I think, is actually wonderful. And it just shows how it pays off. Number 2, an analogy is kind of coming to mind, It's interesting because as a young person myself and as a young father, there's a lot of taking my kids under my wing and even as a young professor or lecturer or teacher, there's a lot of developing what's known as gravity or gravitas, trying to bring the attention of people to myself in some ways, and there's an authentic form of that, authentic gravitas. But the big question that kind of comes up from this document is what kind of gravity am I focusing on? Because, for example, in science fiction, but also in real life science, whenever like in Star Trek, the ship doesn't have enough trajectory to make it home, well, they find some planet to slingshot around so as to gain momentum towards their final destination.
Gravitas.
But there's 2 forms of gravitas, therefore, we see. There's the gravitas that terminates in itself, and frankly, that causes shipwreck. They don't get home. They're forced to settle for less. But then there's the kind of gravitas where it's really about facilitating this loop around. Your gravitas can pull someone in and then slingshot them to the next person. And the image came up while you were speaking of that image, and I'm like, well, maybe a saint is just a slingshot.
A saint is a slingshot.
A saint is a slingshot.
That's great. Well, calls to mind David and Goliath.
Yeah. That's actually
worth pondering.
I'm sure some saint has noticed that.
The saint is a slingshot.
The saint is a slingshot. And when you think of Saint Joseph, he's a father in the shadows, and even that title has gravitas. but he's one who's on the peripheries. He's not home. He's not the end goal. And his entire disposition that we're informed of in the Gospel is one where he's not interested in being in the limelight. He's a just and righteous man. He actually even wants to put Mary aside because he's not sure of how to deal with this. But he puts her away quietly so as to not draw attention. And then the vision comes, and we get a very strong perception of this, a father in the shadows. You know, I don't think it was because he was lazy or anything. We were told he was a just and righteous man. I think it just gives a clear image of sainthood. So then I think we kind of returned full circle here. So this is the 150th anniversary of Saint Joseph being the patron of the church in times of tumultuousness, you know? And this question of authentic gravitas, but towards what is this gravity? Each of us, towards what is our usefulness being described? I think there's in this time period of tumultuousness and confusion, we can all want to be useful, to figure it all out. Come on, listen to me, I've got the idea. We're all grasping for security in some manner, and I think one of the grave temptations is to rely on our own gravity, to bring others to the light. Being
self-referential.
Self-referential. When it really comes down to, maybe this is a great opportunity to embrace being a slingshot once again, to become useless, to desire even to become useless, so as to bring each other and our society into a better focus, a better light. So, you know, maybe being a father in the shadows, it seems like the most counterintuitive thing, you know, because when crisis comes, we either want to retreat or we want to self-assert. And actually retreat is a form of self-assertion, I think, as well, if you really look at it.
I think that would be fair to say.
Yeah, it's like the difference between pride and false humility. They're both the same thing. It's putting one's judgment over the actual state of affairs. I think that the Father in the shadows could certainly help us out in this one.
Yeah, to simply be gift.
To be
freely.
gift.
Yeah.
And in the middle of that, I think, is embracing vocation.
Yeah.
And embracing what is one's responsibility.
It comes back to that notion of not who am I,
but for whom.
For whom am I? And that's where the great discovery of who am I will come, is the for whom am I. But that does require that painful self-sacrifice, but done with joy, as gift. I certainly experienced this with my sons. I see it with the students as well. It's so interesting to see how in their lives, sons and students, and in fact we can say all that we encounter, where there's a taking upon themselves of certain things that they have learned from you. I see that in my own children. I see that in the words of my students, sometimes in the actions of my students. And it's like I recognize that. You know, I know where that was learned, and yet, where that was learned, there's been an ownership that's been taken of it. So there's a bit of feeling useless, of having been forgotten. It's a little bit of like, you know, for a student, well, you should be citing me.
Yeah. You didn't come up with that on your own. That was me. You know?
The thing is, so too for me, I realize that I am also a son. I am a child. I have learned from others, and I have taken it upon myself. It calls to mind that quote from T.S. Eliot, the English poet. You know, the good poet borrows, the great poet steals.
Yeah.
But is it really a stealing? Is this not what fatherhood is about? It can't be stolen if it's been a free gift. It's only stolen if there's a possessiveness about the whole thing. Either possessiveness about the thing itself or possessiveness about the person, in which case it's only on loan. It's like, no, it's gift. And it does involve that stripping away, that sacrifice. So I'm curious, Nick, as we're talking about all of this, and here we stand a month into this year of St. Joseph, but in light of reading this document, how are you going to mark this year?
What are my New Year's resolutions?
Yeah, what are your Joe year's resolutions?
Yeah, my new liturgical year resolutions. I one time went to a new liturgical year party. It was a lot of fun. Those things could either be really good or really kitschy. What are my resolutions? That's a great question. I think just a lot of this year has been, so far, trying to orient my life towards service and order. And the type of order that's actually put towards being the best I can for others. One very small, concrete way that that's actually taken shape is at the end of the day, in my office, I take 15 minutes to half an hour to tidy up my office and to write down what I need to do the first thing the next day and answer any emails and make sure it's clean. And even preparing like the kettle to put on the coffee for. Because what I realize is that's not so much, that is something helpful for my mental health, but it really comes down to, I'm a forgetful person. And if I step into this environment, I'm going to be frazzled and unaware of what I need to do for others that day. And so even it comes down to sticky notes all over my monitor of email this person back, do this back, do. And so that's actually been probably the best New Year's resolution, and I guess St. Joseph resolution ever. It's something no one's ever going to see, except now that they're listening to this podcast. Now everyone knows.
Shoot, there goes the grace.
There goes the grace, yeah. But that's just a little thing no one sees, that it just makes me a more efficient person for everyone else around me. And it's been really good so far, to tell you the truth. Am I getting more done? In some ways, yes, but it's more a matter of how I'm getting it done, that I'm noticing the difference is coming. So how about for yourself? Is there anything?
I think it's the law of the gift. And in striving to live the vocation to love, asking Joseph in his shadowy, silent way to really father me in this more deeply. What does it mean to be gift? That notion of chastity, which is not a possessiveness. So seeing how that can mark all of my relationships and all of my doings, because chastity first and foremost about relating, but also in all happenings, everything is meant to be gift. So how can I be gift? Freedom in that. So it's a bit of a clumsy thing, but just ask Joseph to father me in being a father, being for others, and growing in self-possession so I can make a greater self-gift with joy in the midst of the sorrow and the challenges and the sacrifices with joy. So,
well, that sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess that's probably enough talked about St. Joseph for now. Now I guess we better stop explaining and start accepting, in the words of Pope Francis. Thank you to everyone who tuned into this podcast today. If you liked what you heard, don't hesitate to leave us a comment or leave us an email. And hopefully we'll hear from you in the next little while. Look forward to our future episodes this year. It's a new year and a new slew of podcasts. If there's ever a topic you want to hear about, please let us know. Yeah.
And in the meantime, just a word of encouragement. Go to Joe. Go to Joseph. If you have not yet had a chance to prayerfully read and reflect upon the Holy Father's letter on St. Joseph, it's easily and readily available on the Vatican website. If you just Google, type in Patris, P-A-T-R-I-S, Corde, C-O-R-D-E. Maybe James will be able to put up a link to the document as well. It is worth a prayerful read, and I encourage you. Maybe that could be the first step towards deepening the relationship with Joseph and allowing him to father each of us. So my encouragement, go to Joe, and thank you.
And it's short and sweet.
It's short and sweet.
All right, thank you so much. Take care and God bless.
God bless you.